Get that mutt away from my car before I run it over. Judge Raymond Harlow barked, his voice sharp enough to slice the morning air. His hand hovered over the ignition as though his words alone could move the animal. But the dog didn't flinch. A mottled German Shepherd mix, scarred around the ears and with eyes like burnt amber, stood planted in front of the polished black sedan. Its chest heaved, lips pulled tight over teeth, not in anger but in stubborn resolve. The courthouse steps loomed behind them, still echoing with the morning bustle of clerks and lawyers. But the scene between the man and the dog had pulled everyone's gaze into stillness. "Sir, maybe it belongs to someone," a young clerk, Elena Reyes, tried to say, but Harlow cut her short with a glare. He had no time for strays, not with the biggest sentencing of his career looming over his conscience. Yet something in the way the dog stood, as though it carried the weight of a message, unsettled even him. Raymond wasn't an easily rattled man. His reputation in the courtroom was ironclad, but here, in the shadow of the courthouse, his certainty cracked like glass under pressure. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the cuffs of his robe. The dog backed away only enough to keep distance, then circled toward the rear of the sedan, its nose pressed against the trunk, nails scratching against the glossy paint as it whined low and deep, like a note struck on a cello. Raymond's chest tightened, though he couldn't say why. "What the hell is this about?" he muttered. He pulled his keys from his pocket. The metallic clink louder than it should have been in the tense air. Elena's gaze followed the dog, her throat dry. She had grown up around dogs all her life, and this wasn't ordinary behavior. This wasn't hunger or fear. This was insistence. "Judge, maybe you should look," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Harlow scoffed, already annoyed by what he felt was an unnecessary delay. But when the dog barked again, sharp and urgent, something inside him twisted, the kind of feeling he'd ignored before, back when dismissing instincts cost him more than he liked to admit. He pressed the key into the trunk lock, the mechanism clicking louder than the city traffic beyond. With a reluctant push, the trunk lifted, and the sight beneath the lid froze him in place. Curled in the dim hollow of the compartment was a boy no older than 12, tied at the wrists, his shirt torn and face streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes, wild and terrified, locked onto Raymond's. For a man who had spent his life weighing guilt and innocence, the sudden surge of helplessness struck like a fist. He staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The boy's muffled cries spilled out once the gag slipped loose, and Alina rushed forward, trembling as she reached to untie him. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears welling as she fumbled with the knots. The dog pressed its body closer, whining softly as if reassuring the child that the worst part was over. For Raymond, though, the worst was just beginning. He looked around at the gathering crowd, at the clerks, at the officers who had begun to step closer, their expressions mixing confusion with suspicion. Questions piled in the silence. Who was the boy? How did he get here? And why, out of all the cars in the lot, did the dog stop at his... The boy's first word, hoarse and shaking, came out like a verdict. Help. Just one syllable. But it carried the weight of years. Of nights without safety, of secrets buried beneath authority and robes. Raymond's knees felt weak. The car that bore his name, his rank, his dignity, now carried something that could ruin him or redeem him, depending on truths still hidden. His heart pounded with an unfamiliar rhythm, not of control but of panic. He could already see reporters' faces in his mind, already hear the whispers echoing through court halls about the boy in Judge Harlow's trunk. And yet, amid his spiraling thoughts, he caught sight of the dog again. Its amber eyes held his with a steady, unblinking stare. There was no malice there, no accident. It was as if the animal had chosen this moment, this man, this car, to force open something that was never meant to stay shut. And in that realization, Raymond's anger dissolved into something heavier: fear. Not fear of scandal or judgment, but fear of what kind of darkness could have placed that child inside his trunk, tied and trembling. Fear that the answers were closer to him than he dared believe. The boy clutched Elena's sleeve as she drew him out, his sobs filling the stunned silence. Raymond stood rooted, robe swaying in the morning breeze, his voice gone, and the dog still there, steady, unyielding, sat back on its haunches as though it had delivered its case to the only judge who mattered now. Raymond's pulse hammered in his ears as the crowd thickened, whispers multiplying into a storm he couldn't control. Officers pushed through, their radios crackling, their boots thudding against the pavement. One of them, Sergeant Marcus Doyle, a man Raymond had sentenced his own nephew years back, locked eyes with him now in a way that carried both history and accusation. The boy clung tighter to Alina, trembling like a leaf in her arms, while the dog paced protectively near the child, its fur bristled as though daring anyone to come closer. Raymond wanted to speak, to assert his authority, but for the first time in his career his voice had abandoned him. All he could manage was a hoarse, "I don't know how," before Doyle cut him off. "Judge, step back," Doyle said firmly, his hand hovering near his holster, though his eyes betrayed something more complex than suspicion. "We need to hear from the boy first." The boy's lips trembled as though the very act of speech was a mountain he could not climb. Alina stroked his hair, whispering softly, encouraging him to breathe, to trust. His voice came out cracked, fragile. They put me here. I didn't want to. The words alone carried enough weight to drag every heart in earshot to the ground. But it was the pronoun, the plural, that rattled Raymond. Whoever they were. This wasn't random, and the gnawing thought that someone close, someone trusted, had orchestrated this lodged deep into Raymond's chest like a shard of glass. Reporters had already begun to circle, microphones raised, cameras flashing with ruthless hunger. For a man who had always dictated the rhythm of the courtroom, Raymond found himself drowning in a scene where every second was out of his control. His hands, steady when signing verdicts that altered lives forever, now shook. The dog barked. Suddenly, sharp and commanding, startling everyone, it moved toward the courthouse steps, pausing, then returning to the boy as if urging him to remember, to follow the trail of his own memory. Alina whispered again, "You're safe now. Can you tell us who did this?" The boy's eyes, wide and shimmering, lifted to Raymond. For a moment, time fractured. Raymond's breath caught when the boy's trembling hand raised not toward the officers, not toward Alina but toward him. It was his car. His voice cracked into a sob. "They said it would be safe here. They said he would keep me." The crowd gasped, a collective inhalation that pressed against Raymond's ears like thunder. Doyle's expression hardened. Cameras zoomed closer. Raymond stepped back, his shoes scraping the pavement. He wanted to protest, to deny, but the words felt futile, hollow before they even formed. He had spent decades commanding silence and order with the slam of a gavel. But here, in the open air, silence was no longer his to command. Elena's eyes darted between the boy and Raymond, conflict flashing across her face. She knew him as stern, unyielding, but not cruel. She had admired his commitment to justice, even when others feared him. But now, doubts seeped in like water through cracks. Doyle signaled to officers, and though they hesitated out of deference to the black robe, they moved closer. Raymond lifted his hands instinctively, not in surrender, but in desperate appeal. "Listen to me," he said, his voice breaking with something rawer than pride. "I have no part in this. You know me. You all know me." But his words scattered into the air like ash, powerless against the weight of the boy's trembling accusation. The boy buried his face into Elena's robe, sobbing as though the act of speaking had broken something fragile within him. The dog pressed its muzzle against the child's leg, eyes never leaving Raymond. And in that unblinking stare, Raymond felt the strangest sensation, like standing in a courtroom where the jury had already decided, where evidence he couldn't yet see had already damned him. Then came the twist, subtle but piercing, as Doyle motioned for Raymond to step aside. Another voice broke through the noise, a thin, strained cry from the courthouse doors. A woman, pale, her dress torn at the sleeve, stumbled forward. Her name rippled through the crowd as recognition struck. Clara Jennings, the missing witness from a corruption case that had nearly ended Raymond's career years ago. Her voice cracked with urgency as she pointed past the judge, past the boy, straight toward the courthouse itself. "It's not him," she screamed, her chest heaving. "It's them inside. They're the ones. He doesn't even know." The crowd spun in confusion, cameras whirling to catch her face. The boy stiffened at the sound of her voice, his sobs caught mid-breath, as if the familiarity in her tone unlocked something half-buried. The dog barked again, a booming echo, then darted toward the courthouse doors as if confirming her claim. Doyle froze, torn between orders and instinct, his jaw clenched tight. Elena's eyes widened, her arms tightening around the boy as she whispered urgently, "Do you know her? Do you?" The boy nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, before burying his face again. Raymond felt the ground tilt beneath him, relief colliding with dread. The nightmare had twisted once more, shifting from personal ruin to something far more dangerous, a conspiracy that stretched beyond his comprehension, beyond the courthouse steps, into the very walls where he had ruled for decades. The irony was bitter. The judge, once the master of order, now stood on the brink of chaos he could neither explain nor escape. And at the center of it all was a dog, standing like a sentinel between truth and ruin, refusing to let the story end here. Raymond's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the trunk, the cold steel biting into his palms. The boy had been led inside the courthouse now, surrounded by officers and Elena's trembling protection. But his wide eyes still haunted Raymond. He could not shake the sound of that single, hoarse plea help echoing in his ears. For years he had delivered verdicts as though he stood above the chaos of human suffering. Yet in this moment, stripped of his authority, he felt the world tilt violently beneath his feet. The courthouse walls, once pillars of certainty, now loomed like silent witnesses to an unfolding crime that reached closer to him than he dared to admit. He walked inside with heavy steps, the echoes of his shoes lost in the rush of whispered confusion. The courtroom staff avoided his gaze, but their glances spoke loudly enough here. Suspicion, pity. Alina met him near the security desk, her face pale but resolute. "He won't stop crying," she murmured, her voice soft but carrying the sting of truth. "He said someone put him there, someone who wore your robe." Her words pierced him like a blade, each syllable reminding him that authority could be a disguise as icily as a duty. He swallowed hard, but his throat burned dry. The boy sat on a bench in the lobby, clutching a blanket an officer had wrapped around him. His shoulders shook with every breath. The dog, faithful vigilant, sat nearby, never once straying from the child's side. Its eyes flicked to Raymond, as if warning him not to dare dismiss the weight of what was happening. Raymond felt his chest tighten as he approached, torn between his role as judge and his unshakable humanity as a man confronted with unbearable wrong. He bent slightly, his voice quieter than he intended. "Son, can you tell us who did this?" But the boy recoiled, pressing against the dog's fur, eyes flashing with terror at the sound of his voice. The reaction gutted Raymond. A man of justice should have inspired trust, yet here he was, the symbol of the very fear the child carried. Alina stepped in quickly, her hand resting gently on the boy's arm. "Don't worry, sweetheart, you're safe now. You can tell me," the boy whispered then, so faint they almost missed it, but the words landed like a hammer. "The man in the black robe. He said no one would find me." The courthouse fell into an even deeper silence, every eye fixed on Raymond, the only man in the building wearing that robe. A surge of anger rose in his chest, not at the boy but at the vile possibility that someone had used the sanctity of justice as a mask for cruelty. His breath grew ragged as memories clawed their way back, late nights in chambers, files left unattended, colleagues who whispered behind closed doors. How many moments had he dismissed as harmless when they were cracks in a system built on trust? "This isn't possible," Raymond muttered, though even he heard the hollowness in his tone. Doubt had crept in, wrapping itself like a noose around his certainty. An officer stepped forward. Sergeant Marcus Dwyer, a man Raymond had known for decades. His voice was steady, but there was no warmth in it now. "Judge, until we sort this out, I'm going to need you to come with us." Procedure. The word hung heavy, and Raymond knew better than to resist. Procedure. He had demanded it of others countless times, and now it demanded him. He lifted his hands, palms trembling, and nodded. The weight of his robe, once a shield, now felt like chains dragging him down. As they led him to a side office, he caught Elena's eyes. There was no judgment there, only sorrow, as though she understood that he too was caught in a storm larger than any one man could control. Still, the look unsettled him, because beneath the sorrow lay a flicker of suspicion she could not hide. The boy's cries echoed down the hall even as doors closed between them, muffled but relentless. And always, beneath it all, the dog's low growl carried a sound of loyalty, of truth, of unshaken conviction. In the dim office, Raymond lowered himself into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time in years he felt stripped bare, not by cross-examination or appeal, but by a child's voice that carried more truth than any sworn oath he had ever heard. His chest burned with a mixture of shame and rage, emotions warring inside him as he replayed the boy's words over and over. If not him, then who? Which one of his colleagues, cloaked in the same authority, had committed such cruelty under the guise of law? The thought twisted inside him like a knife. But even in his despair, something sharper cut through. The realization that the dog had chosen him, had stopped his car, had forced this truth into the open. That wasn't chance, it was judgment, but not his own. For years he believed he carried the gavel of final authority. Yet now a scarred animal had shown him that justice answered to something far higher, something beyond human arrogance. His hands clenched, his voice broke into the empty room. "Dear God, what have we allowed inside these walls?" The sound of the boy's sobs, faint even through the closed door, reminded him there was no turning away. Somewhere in the tangle of shadows that haunted this courthouse, truth was waiting, raw and merciless, and he knew whether he survived it or not, this was the trial that would define him. Raymond's pulse thundered in his ears as the boy clung desperately to Alina, his frail body trembling against her steady arms. The air felt charged, every breath weighed down by the gravity of what had been uncovered. The murmurs of the small crowd swelled, yet no one dared step closer, as though they all sensed this moment belonged to truths long buried. The dog remained by the boy's side, silent now, its watchful eyes never leaving Raymond, as if guarding him from something far larger than the trunk of a car. An officer finally pushed through the gathering and froze when his gaze fell on the child. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice breaking the fragile stillness. Questions erupted at once, sharp and unrelenting. How the boy ended up there, who he was, who the car truly belonged to. Raymond's lips parted, but no words came. He could not admit what he suspected. Not yet. He could not confess that his gut screamed this was no coincidence, that perhaps someone inside the courthouse he served so loyally had woven this trap around him. The dog's intervention had spared the boy, but it had also painted a target squarely on Raymond's back. The boy, still weak, tugged Elena's sleeve and whispered something so faint it barely reached her ear. She bent lower, eyes widening, as she caught the words he said. "He was put here last night," she breathed, trembling. The revelation cracked through the crowd like lightning. If true, it meant the child had endured hours suffocating in that trunk, and someone had expected him to be found lifeless by morning. Elena's voice broke as she repeated the boy's words louder, and gasps rippled through those gathered. Raymond's chest burned with anger he had not felt in years. This was no random cruelty. This was orchestration, cold and deliberate. His gaze swept the courthouse steps, scanning the faces he had seen countless times. For a fleeting second, he thought he caught a shadow slipping away, a familiar figure ducking behind the columns, but when he blinked, the image was gone. The dog growled low, hackles raised toward that same direction. It was not a coincidence. It couldn't be. Raymond's hands shook as he closed the trunk with a hollow thud, the sound final like the striking of a gavel. His life, his career, his very sense of justice had shifted in a single moment. And all that remained was a boy's fragile plea for safety and the haunting certainty that someone powerful wanted him silenced. That as the boy sobbed into a arms and the dog pressed protectively against them, Raymond felt the weight of his next decision settle heavy on his shoulders. For the first time, the judge who had passed countless verdicts understood what it meant to face a judgment himself, one delivered not by a court, but by fate, and by the child whose survival now demanded truths too dangerous to ignore. The courthouse parking lot had never felt so heavy with silence. Officers moved quickly, guiding the boy toward an ambulance, while Alina kept close, her hand never leaving his small shoulder. The dog patted alongside them, as though it had appointed itself guardian of the fragile life it had saved. Raymond remained standing by his car, rooted like stone, every breath burning with the weight of what had just been revealed. His title, his robe, his reputation, all of it seemed paper-thin now compared to the raw truth unfolding before him. He had built a career on judging others, but this moment demanded something far greater than legal authority. It demanded courage. When the officer in charge approached, his expression grim, Raymond met his gaze without hesitation. "You'll need to look into everyone," he said firmly. His voice, usually sharp with authority, carried an unfamiliar tremor of vulnerability. "This wasn't an accident. Someone put him there deliberately, and I believe it was meant to reach me." The officer studied him carefully, as though weighing the sincerity in his eyes, and then gave a curt nod. Investigators were already sweeping the lot, but it felt futile to Raymond. Whoever had orchestrated this had slipped away long before the trunk was opened. Alina returned, her face pale but resolute. "The boy's name is Samuel," she whispered. "He said he doesn't know who grabbed him. He just remembers being pushed into the dark." Her eyes glistened as she looked at Raymond. "But he recognized your car. He said he'd seen it before, near the foster home where he lived." The words landed like a blow. Raymond's breath faltered, his mind racing with images of files he had signed, cases he had dismissed, petitions he had denied. How many times had his pen decided the course of a child's life? How many had slipped through the cracks while he convinced himself he was upholding the law? The dog brushed against his leg then, startling him. He looked down into those steady amber eyes and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't guilt alone, though, that pressed hard on his chest. It was recognition. The dog hadn't simply exposed a crime. It had torn open the distance Raymond had built between judgment and humanity. For years he had spoken of justice as though it was separate from compassion, as though rulings could be clean when lives were not. But Samuel's trembling figure, curled in the trunk of his car, had shattered that illusion. Later that evening, long after the boy had been taken to safety, Raymond stood in his chambers, robe draped across the chair rather than his shoulders. The courthouse was quiet, but he could still hear echoes of the Designol's hoarse whisper, Elena's trembling voice, the dog's insistent bark that refused to be ignored. He closed his eyes and saw the gavel in his hand, no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of responsibility. Justice wasn't about punishment alone. It was about listening, about protecting, about refusing to let innocence be buried in silence. The next morning, when court convened, he addressed the room not as a judge towering above, but as a man who had been forced to confront his own blindness. He spoke of Samuel without revealing details that might harm the boy, but with enough weight to let every person in that chamber feel the urgency of what had been uncovered. "Justice is not an abstract principle," he said, voice steady, despite the storm inside him. "It is a living promise, one we either honor with vigilance or betray with silence." The courtroom, accustomed to his stern authority, heard something new in his tone, something raw, human, and undeniable. After the session, Raymond stepped outside, robe folded over his arm, and found Elena waiting with the dog at her side. Its tail swayed once, slow and steady, as if acknowledging a verdict had been delivered. He crouched down, pressing a hand to its scarred head, and for the first time in years felt gratitude unshaped by pride. The boy was safe. The truth was now a flame that could not be extinguished, and he knew his own life had changed in ways no ruling could capture. As the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long light across the courthouse steps, Raymond let the silence settle. The dog looked out toward the horizon, ears alert, as though ready for the next call only it could hear. Raymond followed its gaze and understood. Some judgments are spoken in words, others in actions, and a few are delivered in the unyielding stare of a creature that refused to let the truth remain hidden. That was the kind of justice he would carry forward, not the one bound by robes or titles, but the kind that remembered Samuel's trembling voice and the dog's relentless bark. And when he finally turned away, he felt lighter, though the weight, of responsibility would never leave him. It wasn't supposed to. That too was the lesson. Some burdens are not chains but reminders. Some verdicts are not about guilt but about change. And in the quiet steps that carried him away from the courthouse, Raymond knew he had been judged as surely as any man who had stood before him. The dog's amber eyes had made sure of it.